Too many questions.
And again, answer only those that you desire to answer.
The gentleman asked why I didn't
question.
talk about the
Excellent
social and the
questions.
political dimension. If we have 2 hours or longer, I may talk about that. But since I only have 15 minutes, I have to be selective. About what's more necessary, this is a very complicated question. I think it's not only that my colleagues in Hong Kong made an argument, but also, for instance, Harvard professor Amartya Sen, in a number of his writings, talk about the necessity of Mao's period development as precondition for reform to be successful. It's not just Mao. Mao here stands for the whole period. Regarding with Professor Kramer's question, I think it's quite a fascinating question. I didn't investigate this question until quite recently. I heard a great deal about the 信仰危机 and the crisis of faith and so on. And then I use a nationwide survey data, published a paper on this issue. In the paper, I argue, in fact, there's no crisis of faith, rather it's a crisis of the implementation of the moral standards. In the survey data, I can tell the people have more or less a consensus on many moral issues, and mostly socialist moral issues. A great degree of consensus. The only problem is they cannot practice in their own behavior. I didn't ask themselves, the survey didn't ask themselves whether they practice those moral standards. Rather, they ask the people to value another people's behavior, rather another people follow those standards. They believe another people don't. So the question, I think we have to make a distinction about whether the people have the confusion about a moral standard, or people have the problem with implement or behave in a moral way. So that's my question. The paper was published in Chinese, but there's no English version yet.
Cassandra?
Yeah, interesting questions. I think most of them were sort of addressed to Wang Shaoguang, but there are a few. The issue of the moral register, I think, is a very interesting one. I think it really allows us to think of, something. There are modern ideologies, whether they're socialist or modernization and so on, that allow one to judge success by the end, by the telos, by the goal of what is achieved, so that the process of how you go about doing it is not necessarily central to determining success or not. And I think it's very important to develop an alternative in order to get at the moral issues, because the moral is bypassed when you are talking about the telos. Secondly, the Asia and civilizational values linked to, I think that I wouldn't essentialize Asia here. I think that it's much more connected to the particular historical circumstances, which is that Asian society is still largely agrarian with community values there, in a way that certainly West European society was not. You already had your Durkheim, who had theorized about urban society and values and so on. But I think what's very interesting, I think the Latin American question keeps coming back. There is a very strong return of certain notions of community and social values in the Latin American issue. And I think it'll be more interesting to see it within that dimension of what was the historical circumstances. Finally, I think that the question of this young student about institutional socialism and welfare regimes is something we need to think about, because I think that there is a difference between welfare society and socialism, though welfare itself may have been influenced by socialism. But the whole modes of distribution, I think in some ways what Wang Shaoguang was talking about was more a welfare society in phase 3, right, which bypasses sort of community forms of distribution and so on. I'm not a communitarian, though I do have some sympathy in that, but a lot is lost when you go directly. And so that's something interesting to think about, I think. We don't need to redefine socialism, but we need to see a much larger than a purely economic dimension to it.
Well, thank you all for your fascinating presentations and inputs. I've learned hugely from everything, and I'll go back with lots of questions to grapple with in my own mind. But for shortage of time, I'll also just take up the large question about civilization and culture. You know, the Indian sociologist Ashish Nandi once said, cricket is an Indian game accidentally invented by the British. And my esteemed colleague at the back of the room seemed to suggest that socialism is an Asian tradition accidentally invented by the West. So, but it's a fascinating large question. And I agree with Prashantjit. I think it's not about culture, it's about politics and economics. You know, apart from communitarianism, I think an important reason for the endurance of socialism, and it's clear there is an endurance. I mean, you can't have a panel easily at Harvard on North American varieties of socialism, right? And you know, you'd be all. I suppose even that I'm not sure when last the Center
In
for
the
Europe.
60s.
Yeah, I'm telling you today. I'm not sure when last the Center for European
Or the
Studies had a
19th
panel
century, or the 19th century,
Or the
all the
19th
experiments.
Absolutely.
or even post World War I with Eugene Thomas, Eugene Debs and Norman Thomas. So there is something about what you say. In Europe, certainly you can't have a panel on Europe. But I think it's to do not with culture, not with essentialism, but with also with deep and pervasive poverty and inequality. Professor Wang's remarks about 3.0, that you sort of, why is socialism coming back? Why is socialism in all the party documents now? You have economic growth, you also have polarization, and you have still large numbers of people living basically subsistence, livelihoods. And in India too, why has Maoism arisen now? It's not because we are Asian, but because there's the visible disparities between rich and poor. And Latin America, again, the kind of socialist populism of the Chavez kind of variety. And given the way the American economy is going now, don't rule out a panel 20 years later on that. Can I make one last comment?
Please.
It's a question to you, Tam. Since we're meeting at the Center for European Studies, there's a story I've heard which I like very much, and I don't know what the historical authenticity of this is. It's to do with Ho. Mm-hmm. Ho is supposed to have come to India. He came to India in 1956, and he's supposed to have said, if Mahatma Gandhi had been fighting the French, he would have given up non-violence within a week. So I'd like it.
Well, I thank you all very much for your excellent questions, and our panelists for their penetrating and humorous responses. And you're all welcome to join us upstairs for a reception. Thank you very much.